In a small town, a funeral was held in memory of a teenage boy by the name of Darren. The funeral was attended by his family, his friends from school and his best friend called Steve, but in secret he is not dead, and has been playing video games in his coffin all this time. A couple days earlier Darren was a regular teenage kid, living in a suburban home, having good grades, friends, overcaring parents, and nothing to worry about. As he was about to go into class, his best friend Steve caught up with him and the two skipped class and went up to the roof of the building. There Steve tells Darren that his mother is always drunk and that he hates his life and someday he'll run away to move to Mexico. After Steve breaks some light bulbs, he dared Darren to break some and calls him to be a Mr. Goody to shoes. So Darren broke some and they were caught, and Darren gets a good scolding from his parents about how to have a happy, productive life, about going to college, having a good job, and starting a family. The next day after, Darren meets up with Steve and tells him about it but assures him that their bond could never be broken. While they are standing on the sidewalk, a mysterious limo approaches them, followed by a mist and a hand threw a green paper out of the window, only to realize it's a rare freak show called Cirque du Freak coming to town that will happen tonight, and the two plans to attend. At night Darren escapes out his window and grabbed his bike to meet Steve, and the two hit it off. Coming to a dark alley, Steve recollects from his vampire books, which he is obsessed with, that the moon only turns to this color only when there is a vampire in town. Upon entering the old venue, they are greeted by the head of the circus, Mr. Tall, and the two gives him their tickets, which they purchased from the small monster outside. The two boys walked into the old theater and sat in the front row, where they saw all kinds of freaks who came to perform. The two were amazed as they seen many strange acts, including a Wolfman which bit a lady's arm clean off, only to show that it was part of the show, the lady that can grow her limbs back. Then followed by a man with no rib cage and no skin on his abdomen area, and his internal organs were showing, which made Steve feel disgusted. Then came a short man with the longest head and a two-bellied man that can fit all kinds of things inside his belly. A snake boy that is covered in snakeskin, and then a lady called Madame Trusca was carried to the stage in a carriage and demands an assistant from the audience and chooses Darren. She is also a fortune teller, and midway through her performance sees a short vision of death and destruction for Darren. Then she snaps out of it, takes Darren's hands, and touched her face with them, only to show that she grows a full bushy beard within seconds whenever a male touches her face. Steve and Darren think it all a joke until a vampire, Lawton Crepsley, the next performer, comes flitting onto the stage with his very rare and poisonous spider at an unbelievable speed. Something only a vampire can do. Immediately Darren becomes mesmerized by the colorful spider, while Steve suspects the man to be a very old vampire from the 1800s, as he saw the man from one of his vampire books having the same face, hair, and scar from the book's picture. But the man heard the boys and threatens to have them smothered in their beds if there indeed a vampire exists, and that he knows that the boys knew about him. Not long after, the show is interrupted by the police. The boys realized that their teacher was also there, and they quickly got up and ran. Slipping away from the police raid, the boys split up. Darren, due to his infatuation with spiders as strong as Steve's infatuation with vampires, sneaks backstage to examine Crepsley's cage spider more closely. As he hears that someone is coming, he quickly hid in the closet. While hiding in a closet, he overhears Crepsley talking to his vampire associate about Mr. Tiny trying to stage a fight between the Vampanese and the vampires. Suddenly Steve comes barging into Crepsley's room, begging Mr. Crepsley to make into vampire because he hates his depressing life so much. Mr. Crepsley tests Steve but finds he has bad blood and will not transform him. Steve becomes angry and threatening before being thrown out by Crepsley's vampire associate, and then he too becomes angry because Crepsley refuses to help him fight against the Vampanese and leaves abruptly. Crepsley realizes his spider is missing. Escaping the theater with Crepsley's spider, Darren quickly accepts a ride home from the same stranger, Mr. Tiny, who seems to have designs on Darren and vampires and, very conveniently, just happens to have Darren's bicycle in the trunk of his limo. In the car he sees Merlot, a very bloodthirsty Vampanese. Merlot keeps suggesting that Darren is too weak and acts like a bag of blood, and he should kill him, but is hushed by Mr. Tiny, who has very high expectations of Darren. He prophesies that Darren would become a very bloodthirsty vampire and start a bloody war which will bring about the end of countless lives. Mr. Tiny plucks out of Darren's hair from his head and tells him he will find out his destiny from his DNA. He drops Darren off at his house and tells him that he will be in touch. Next day, Darren takes the spider to school with him. Steve finds out and told him that he stole from a vampire and should realize he's a dead man. The spider gets out, panics the students and caused chaos in the school hall with the teachers and students. As it tries to escape through the window, Steve tries to kill it with a broom, but the spider jumps up and bites Steve in the face and escapes. That night, Darren goes back to the old theater to see Mr. Crepsley about the possibility of an antidote and sees Crepsley there. Despite Crepsley threatening to kill Darren, he insists he will do anything for him to save his best friend from dying from that spider bite. Crepsley still refuses to give the antidote, then realizes that he needs a servant who will do his bidding in the daytime. He tells Darren that he will make him a half-vampire and he will look after his coffin while he sleeps during the daytime. The vampire agrees to give him the antidote only if Darren agrees to become his half-vampire assistant. Darren agrees, so Crepsley tells him to raise his hands to and align his fingers with Darren's and cuts them with his sharp fingers, and then cuts his own and says that they need to exchange blood and to wait for it to reach your heart. Then Crepsley tells Darren to hop on his back and they would flit to the hospital. They then climbed up the hospital walls to Steve's room. There Crepsley immediately cuts the vein on Steve's forearm with his finger and sips the antidote and injects him using his mouth. As soon as Darren saw that Steve was recovering, he quickly sounds the hospital alarm and formed a cross using his fingers. That made Crepsley very mad, but leaves right after saying to Darren to not to do something stupid like killing your family. Then the nurses came rushing in. Steve recovers the next day and is happy at school, but doesn't realize that Darren is now part vampire. Darren concurrently develops a taste for raw meat and came very close to killing his little sister and drinking her blood. When Crepsley came, Darren tells him that he doesn't want to hurt people and that he is not like him. So Darren goes into his parents' bedroom and tells them he loves them very much. While Darren and Crepsley are sitting on the roof, Crepsley made him look away and then he snapped his neck. At the funeral, Steve came say his words to the body, being angry with Darren for leaving him all alone with these idiots, and slips a phone into his hand only to then realize how warm and full of blood his hands are. Believing he is still alive, he tries to wake the dead body up and is stopped by his teacher, which Steve hates. That night at full moon, Crepsley comes to dig up Darren from his grave with a shovel. After reaching the coffin, he opened it. And then Crepsley, with his vampire senses, sensed that another vampire is approaching and told Darren to go back into the ditch. When Darren refuses again, he pushed him and then body slammed by the Vampinese Merlot. The two fought at high speed and strength. Eventually Merlot throws Crepsley out of the ditch with super strength, only to get slammed in the face with a shovel. Crepsley pulls Darren out of the ditch and tells him to run. Darren ran like crazy across the graveyard. Merlot defeats Crepsley momentarily and runs at super speed after Darren and picks him up. Merlot tells Darren that you're one of us and not one of those filthy vampires. Merlot is running while carrying Darren in the bag before being hit by a heavy concrete headstone that Crepsley throws. Crepsley picks up Darren and runs. Merlot runs after them. Crepsley decisively stops in the freeway and waits for Merlot to get slammed by a truck. Finally, they arrived at the circus, and Crepsley tells Darren not to stare while they walked across the freaks. Crepsley tells Darren to wait outside while he speaks with the head of the circus, Mr. Tall, for him to let you stay here. Mr. Tall reminds Crepsley that the circus has always been neutral and do not involve in the conflict between vampires and Vampinese. While trying to eavesdrop on the conversation, Darren meets Rebecca, who also lives in the circus. They both try to hear the conversation before Mr. Tall pulls them into the tent and said that children never do what they are told. Mr. Tall agrees and tells Rebecca to take Darren to his tent. Steve is depressed as he misses his best friend Darren. During class, he squeezes his paper and throws it at his teacher's face and leaves to go to the rooftop. There he was thinking self-deleting himself by jumping down the building. As he came close to jumping, he was interrupted by Mr. Tiny. Mr. Tiny tells Steve that Darren is still alive and that he has stolen his dream of becoming a vampire. He tells Steve about his plan to rule the world and he needs the help of one of two dear friends. As Darren begins a life of chores amid his new family at the free camp, he was tasked with cleaning the Wolfman's cage, feeding Octa the spider, collecting rats for the tiny people to eat. He dusts Crepsley's coffin. He practices his flitting, which is running at super speed, which didn't end well. That night, Darren gets very lonely as he saw pictures of his best friend on his phone and hesitated, but then calls Steve, but no one picks up. He was interrupted. Mr. Tiny visits the circus as he is greeted by his minions, the small people, for he created them. In Mr. Tall's tent, Mr. Tiny makes small threats towards Crepsley. He then asks Mr. Tall to promptly give him the bow as he has plans to raise a bloodthirsty army and bring about the cataclysm which he dreams about. Mr. Tall refuses. Then Mr. Tiny said he always gets what he wants and leaves right after telling the little people to watch Darren closely. Darren visits Rebecca's workshop asking for Crepsley's cape. Darren shuts the door to avoid the two of the little people. As Darren was about to walk out the back door, Rebecca tells him his pants are ripped and she picks out one from the wardrobe that fits Darren perfectly. While there he asks Rebecca what kind of a freak she is and that she seems normal. Rebecca tells him that she is a monkey girl and that she has a tail. Darren doesn't believe her but she keeps it wrapped up because people keep stepping on it. She asked if he has a problem with it. At night Darren was spied on by one of the little people when caught by Crepsley and thrown back into its cage. When Darren asked Crepsley if it was okay if he was interested in a girl with a tail. To which Crepsley said, if you had asked me a couple hundred years ago if I would be dating a girl with a full beard on her face, I would say never, but look at me now. Then Crepsley said that there is a new rule and that is he should never leave the circus. So he takes him to a dark and secluded area. He asks him when was the last he was in a fight. To which Darren replies in second grade, Steve was the one who always gets in all the fights. Crepsley said that Steve isn't here anymore to fight for you. Crepsley disappears and tries to sneak up on Darren as a test. Darren anticipated him and quickly threw a punch at him. Crepsley stopped it and said he shouldn't use fists. Instead use your fingernails as a dagger. Crepsley demonstrates it on a tree trunk. When Darren tries it, he hurt his hand and said he broke a nail. Crepsley said you are soft and weak and needs blood. Steve meets Murloc and gets initiated by other Vampires. Murloc tells his minions to turn and kill Steve. After Steve turns into a vampire, he visits his teacher, Mr. Kersey, for his first kill. Crepsley explains to Darren that he doesn't have to kill people to drink their blood. He renders them unconscious and drink a portion of their blood and leave after. He says he and two other vampires like him developed a method to do that. When the other vampires realize this, half of the vampires now drink human blood without killing people, and the other half hates them for it. As the human they waited for arrived, Crepsley gave off his breath that made the human pass out. Darren is amazed. He tells Darren to drink from the human, and that he had some a couple of days ago. It's very refreshing. He could do all kinds of amazing stuff as long as he drinks blood. But Darren refuses to drink blood. At the circus, four Vampires visit the freak camp. They came looking for Darren under orders from Mr. Tiny. The freaks saw the bloodthirsty men that came. They checked Darren's tent to find Ever's pet snake. They eventually found Darren in Rebecca's workshop. One of them pushes Ever away. Darren tries to fight them but is very weak. He smashes one of them in the face with an iron but he heals it instantly. Crepsley came and smashed one face into the mirror, then kicks another way. He took Darren and flitted to his tent. There he opened his coffin to find another way into the sewers. One of the freaks frees the Wolfman from his cage, and he fight as the Vampires before being overpowered by the four at the same time. All the freaks came out to face them, the two-bellied man. The long-headed freak threatened to shove his head up one of their ass. Then Mr. Tall came and stopped the fight and told them the Vampire Council will hear of this, which made them fall back. Two of them came and took Rebecca and told Everett to tell Darren to come home if he wants the girl back. Under the sewer there are spare coffins, where Crepsley decides to sleep in one. Darren goes back up to the circus to find that Rebecca is missing and Everett told him everything. He leaves immediately. Steve comes into Darren's home to his family when they were having dinner. Mr. Tiny too arrives where they kidnap the family. Darren is given a lift on the way when he felt the urge of drinking blood, and was very close to biting the girl sitting in the back with him. He arrived home to find there is no one in the house. In the living room, a message was left for him to come to the theater. When Crepsley wakes he realizes what Darren has done and immediately prepares himself for battle. He picks up two knives from the two freaks who are practicing trying to fit all the knives into the two-bellied man. Darren arrives at the theater and is welcomed by Murloc performing a little dance on the stage. Darren asks for his family and Rebecca. He sees that they have captured Rebecca. She was tied and gagged and left hanging, and also his family too. Murloc says for bags of blood. Darren tells them they are going to be okay. Murloc says they'll be better than okay, they'll be delicious. He tells Darren that he is about to be reunited with his only friend and blood brother. Steve hands Darren a knife. Darren becomes angry and pushes Steve. Steve smiles and retaliates by pushing Darren. With his Vampire strength, he sends swooping across the air and smashing into some chairs. Crepsley arrives and kills one Vampire on the spot. Mr. Tiny lets him in and says he wants to see how this all plays out. As Darren is defeated and is about to surrender, Crepsley arrives and throws his spider onto Steve's face, which occupies him. Crepsley and Merlaut begins their fight by throwing knife at each other and catching it. They heal themselves and continues on until they meet. They start their battle. It is bloody and ferocious. Merlaut bites Crepsley. Merlaut tries to bite Crepsley again. Merlaut's tooth gets broken and stuck on Crepsley's forehead. As the two battle it out, Rebecca uses her hidden tail to free her from the tied knot. She finds Darren and tells him that he needs blood. Meanwhile, Steve defeats the spider and goes to help Merlaut. The two begin fighting on the ceiling and onto the balconies. Steve picks up one of Crepsley's knife and follows them. Crepsley is overpowered and is slowing down when Steve stabs him with both knives. He screams and falls down to the floor. Rebecca offers her blood to Darren, saying she needs it right now to fight. Darren keeps refusing until giving in and bites he in the neck. Not long after, Darren walks out feeling all-powerful and full of strength. As Crepsley is about to be stabbed by Steve, he flits instantly across and slams into Steve. Crepsley quickly got the knife and stabs Merlaut in the heart. Merlaut says, "My people are not weak. They will avenge me." Merlaut dies. Our battle is over, but the war begins now. The truce between vampires and vampanese is broken. Mr. Tiny comes applauding all four of them, saying the words marvelous and brilliant with enthusiasm. Steve told Mr. Tiny that they started the war like he asked. Darren says there won't be a war if nobody hears about it. They ran towards each other and slams into each other with rage. They fight with super speed. The battle between the youngsters was more energetic, flitting across the room with super speed. Darren gets on Steve and tells him that he hates him and that he became a vampire to save him. Steve says he lies and still fights him. Darren avoids a jab from Steve. Darren, being more powerful and skillful, holds Steve to kill him with a sharp slash with his hand, but hesitates because he cares about his best friend. Steve said, "Go ahead, do it," and the two continues fighting in super speed until they are stopped by Mr. Tiny. He uses his powers to stop them in midair and the two hits the floor. Mr. Tiny orders Steve to stand down and come with him. He says it is all written down in a book and that they will meet again. Darren tells Steve to not go. Steve says, "And then what? Leave with you and a bunch of freaks. I have my destiny and you have yours." Mr. Tiny tells Darren that he too will come home to us one day. "After all, you are the bloodthirsty one." Darren says, "Just because I'm a vampire doesn't mean I'm bloodthirsty. It's about who you choose to become." Mr. Tiny uses his powers to transform Merlaut's body to one of the little people, and the three of them leave in the limo. Hours later, Darren says goodbye to his sister. His parents' memories of the incident are wiped by Crepsley. Although they have no memory, they'll always feel that Darren is alive. Darren and Rebecca stood in front of the house when he asks to kiss Rebecca. Rebecca says yes and to kiss before being interrupted by Crepsley and said we have to return to the circus, and he can't carry both of them. Darren says he can run on his own now. At the circus, Crepsley is told by his mistress of how proud she is of him. The freaks hold a meeting to vote if Darren is to be accepted into the circus. All his newly found friends raise their hands and he is accepted. Everybody cheers for him. Later, Darren tells Crepsley he spent all this time wanting not to stay with the circus, but now he wouldn't want it to happen any other way. Crepsley says dawn is coming and he has something made for him in his tent. Gevner is happy with what Crepsley and Darren did, and they should leave to show the boy who he really is. Crepsley says give him 1 day to rest, he has earned it. Darren finds out that Crepsley has given him a brand new coffin as a present. He opens it to begin his first sleep during the day. Hello guys, this is my first ever movie recap video. Please like this video, subscribe to my channel to get notified of more awesome movie recaps to come weekly. Thank you for watching.